One satisfying palm strike. That's all it took. A weapon that had 3 trained armourers scratching their heads, a young gunner red-faced and sweating, and an entire qualification line shut down, fixed by a 75-year-old man who had to use a cane just to walk to the turret. If that doesn't remind you that real experience can never be replaced, nothing will. Type respect in the comments if you believe the old guard still has what it takes. It was a Saturday morning in late September, the kind of morning where the air still held a thin bite of overnight chill, but the sun was already promising something warmer by noon. Fort Riley's Range 14 was alive with the controlled chaos of a reserve unit's annual weapons qualification day, the kind of event that showed up on the training calendar months in advance and still somehow felt like a surprise when it arrived. Humvees and MRAPs were staged in neat rows along the gravel apron behind the firing line, their hoods propped open for pre-checks, their turrets fitted with the heavy black silhouettes of crew-served weapons. Soldiers in ACUs moved between vehicles carrying ammo cans, clipboards, and the particular expression of people who had woken up far too early on what was supposed to be their weekend. The range tower stood at the far end, its windows reflecting the pale Kansas sky, a tinny loudspeaker crackling out range commands that echoed across the flat terrain. There were paper targets downrange at 200, 400, and 600 meters, their shapes barely visible against the tan earth and scrub grass. The smell of CLP and burnt powder already hung in the air from the earlier small arms qualifications, and now it was time for the heavy stuff, the mounted weapon systems, the .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun, Marduce. Sergeant First Class Darnell Coleman stood near the range control point with a clipboard pressed against his thigh, running through the firing order one more time. Coleman was a career reservist, 12 years in, a logistics NCO who took qualification days seriously because they were one of the few times his unit actually got to put hands on the weapons they were supposed to know. He was a compact man, all efficiency and short sentences, with a kind of closely trimmed mustache that somehow looked regulation even when it probably wasn't. He had spent the previous 2 weeks coordinating ammunition draws, range reservations, and vehicle assignments, and now he just wanted the day to go clean. No safety violations, no equipment failures, no drama. A smooth day. He would have settled for an uneventful day. He wasn't going to get either. The vehicle assigned to the first serial of .50 caliber qualification was an up-armoured Humvee with a ring mount turret, and the gunner scheduled to fire first was Specialist Tyler Briggs. Briggs was 22 years old, fresh out of his MOS school, with the kind of clean-shaven face and squared-away uniform that said he was still trying to impress people. He had qualified on the M4 and the M249 earlier that morning with respectable scores, and he had been talking about the .50 caliber since the previous drill weekend. He had fired it exactly once before, during a familiarization exercise at Fort Drum, and he remembered the raw, thumping power of it, the way the concussive blast seemed to punch through his chest armor even with ear protection. He wanted to feel that again. He climbed into the turret with the enthusiasm of someone who didn't yet know what the day had planned for him. The M2 Browning heavy machine gun is one of the most legendary weapons in the American military arsenal. Designed by John Moses Browning in the closing days of World War I, it has been in continuous service for over a century. It has been mounted on everything from infantry tripods to naval vessels, from bombers to tanks, from Humvees to helicopters. It fires the .50 BMG cartridge, a round so powerful it can penetrate light armor, disable vehicles, and engage targets at distances exceeding a mile. The weapon itself is a masterpiece of controlled violence, weighing in at around 84 pounds for the receiver alone, with a rate of fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. But for all its legendary status, Marduce has a reputation among soldiers that goes beyond its killing power. She's reliable, devastatingly effective, and deeply unforgiving of anyone who doesn't understand her. The M2 requires precise headspace and timing adjustment. Get it wrong, and the weapon won't fire. Get it very wrong, and the weapon can catastrophically malfunction. Every soldier who has ever worked with the M2 knows that she demands respect. She's not a weapon you can fake your way through. She knows if you don't know her. Briggs settled into the turret, his boots braced against the interior floor plates, his hands finding the familiar butterfly triggers. The assistant gunner, Private First Class Rivera, had loaded the first belt of linked ammunition and closed the feed tray cover. Briggs performed his pre-fire checks the way he had been taught, going through the steps with the careful deliberation of someone reading from a mental checklist. He charged the weapon twice, pulling the charging handle to the rear with both hands and letting it slam forward, seating the first round. He gave Rivera a thumbs up. Rivera relayed to Coleman. Coleman relayed to the range tower. The range was hot. Briggs pressed the butterfly triggers. The M2 erupted with its signature deep rhythmic pounding, the sound rolling across the flat Kansas terrain like slow thunder. Brass casings flew from the ejection port in a golden arc, tinkling against the Humvee's armor. Dust kicked up downrange as the heavy rounds tore into the target berms. Briggs was grinning behind his eye protection. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. The first burst was clean. 5 rounds. He released, adjusted his aim slightly and pressed again. Another burst. 3 rounds this time, walking the impacts across the target. He was doing well. He knew he was doing well. He pressed the triggers a third time. The weapon fired 2 rounds and stopped. Not a gradual slowdown. Not a click. A hard, mechanical seizure. The bolt had locked forward in a position that was neither fully in battery nor fully retracted. The charging handle was frozen. The weapon sat there in the suddenly quiet turret like a piece of angry sculpture, still hot, still loaded, and completely unwilling to move. Briggs stared at the weapon. He tried the charging handle. It didn't budge. He repositioned his grip, put his shoulder into it, and pulled again. Nothing. The handle might as well have been welded to the receiver. He felt the first cold trickle of embarrassment mixing with his adrenaline. He had been taught immediate action drills for the M2. He knew them. He was sure he knew them. Pull the charging handle to the rear. If the bolt moves, charge twice and attempt to fire. If the bolt doesn't move, the weapon has a stoppage that requires armorer-level intervention. The bolt was not moving. "Cease fire on lane 3, Coleman's voice came over the radio, flat and unsurprised in the way of NCOs who have seen every possible thing go wrong on a range day. "We have a stoppage." Briggs climbed halfway out of the turret, his face red, his hand still gripping the receiver as if he could will the malfunction away through physical contact. "I can't get it to charge, Sergeant," he called down. "The handle's locked up. I think it's a headspace issue." Coleman walked over, looked up at the weapon, and sighed the kind of sigh that carries the weight of an entire ruined timeline. He keyed his radio and called for the armorer team. Qualification was on pause. The day had just gotten longer. The armorers arrived within minutes, 3 of them, led by Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a wiry man with oil-stained hands and the perpetually annoyed expression of someone whose expertise was only ever needed when something had gone wrong. Webb climbed up onto the Humvee's hood and leaned into the turret, peering at the M2 with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a wound. His 2 assistants, Corporal Diaz and Specialist Henning, stood below, passing up tools and offering opinions that Webb neither requested nor acknowledged. "Headspace is off," Webb said after a minute of examination, pulling a headspace and timing gauge from his kit. "Somebody set this thing up wrong. The bolt isn't seating right." "I set it up by the book," Briggs said from where he stood nearby, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Webb didn't look at him. "The book doesn't jam guns, Specialist. Hands do." He adjusted the barrel, checked the gauge, tapped something with a combination wrench, and tried the charging handle. It didn't move. He tried again, harder. Still frozen. He muttered something under his breath that was not suitable for official reports and tried a different approach, working the bolt from the opposite side, applying pressure in different directions. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The line of soldiers waiting to qualify had started leaning against their vehicles, some pulling out phones, others drifting toward the water cooler that sat on a folding table near the range tower. Corporal Diaz climbed up to assist, and now there were 2 men hunched over the weapon, arguing in the low, technical shorthand of armourers about whether the problem was headspace, timing, or a deformed round casing stuck in the chamber. Specialist Henning offered a suggestion from below involving a brass punch and a mallet. Webb told him to go find something useful to do. Henning wandered off to look for a brass punch and a mallet. 15 minutes had now passed since the malfunction. Coleman was on the radio with the range tower explaining the delay. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant named Park, had walked over from the admin tent and was standing with his hands on his hips, watching the armourers work with the expression of someone calculating how this was going to affect his training metrics. Nobody noticed the old man at first. That was the thing about him. He was the kind of person who existed at the margins of events, present but unremarked upon, the way a piece of old furniture occupies a room without drawing the eye. He had arrived at the range about an hour earlier, driving a faded blue Ford F-15 that looked like it had seen as many years of service as he had. He had parked near the spectator area, a roped-off section behind the firing line where family members and retirees were allowed to watch qualification from a safe distance. He had gotten out of the truck slowly, reaching back inside for a wooden cane with a curved handle, the kind that looked like it had been carved by hand rather than bought from a medical supply store. He wore a plain khaki jacket, dark trousers, work boots that were clean but old, and a faded black ball cap with no visible insignia. His face was deeply lined, the skin tanned and weathered in a way that spoke of decades spent outdoors, and his eyes were the colour of creek water, pale and sharp beneath heavy brows. His hair, what was visible beneath the cap, was white and cut close. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy, because it no longer had energy to waste. He was 75 years old, and he looked every year of it. His name was Earl Jessup. Master Sergeant Earl Jessup, United States Army, retired. But nobody at Range 14 knew that yet. To them, if they noticed him at all, he was just another old retiree who had shown up to watch the young soldiers play with the big guns. Fort Riley had a lot of them. Retired NCOs and officers who lived in the surrounding towns, and still felt the pull of the base, who came to watch ranges and ceremonies the way former athletes show up at their old stadiums. They were treated with casual politeness at best, gentle dismissiveness at most. They were yesterday. The range was today. Jessup had been watching the qualification from his spot near the rope line, leaning on his cane with both hands, his expression unreadable. He had watched the small arms qualifications with quiet attention. He had watched the vehicle stage for the mounted weapons serial. He had watched Briggs climb into the turret with the eagerness of youth, and he had watched the M2 fire its first clean bursts with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And he had watched the weapon jam. He had watched Briggs struggle with the charging handle. He had watched the armourers arrive, argue, probe, and fail. He had been watching for 20 minutes now, and something in his posture had changed. The relaxed lean on the cane had become something more upright, more attentive. His jaw had tightened, his eyes had narrowed. He looked like a man who was trying very hard not to say something. He failed. Jessup walked forward, past the rope line, across the gravel apron, toward the Humvee where the armourers were still working. His cane tapped against the ground with each step, a slow, rhythmic sound that was somehow audible, even over the ambient noise of the range. Coleman noticed him first and moved to intercept. "Sir, this is an active range area. I need you to stay behind the observation line." Jessup stopped. He looked at Coleman with those pale, sharp eyes. "I know what an active range looks like, son. I've been on more of them than you've had hot meals." His voice was calm, unhurried, with a slight rasp that might have been age, or might have been the residue of decades of shouting over engines and gunfire. "Your 50's got a stuck bolt. Forward assist won't clear it. Your armourers are checking headspace, but that's not the problem. The problem is the bolt lug is riding over the barrel extension because the backplate isn't seated flush. It happens when the recoil buffer gets worn, and the spring doesn't return the bolt carrier all the way into position after sustained fire. Or in this case, after somebody reassembled the weapon and didn't check the buffer spring tension." Coleman blinked. He looked at the old man, at the cane, at the faded jacket, and then back at the old man's face. "Sir, I appreciate the input, but we have qualified armourers handling this. If you could just step back behind the line, we'll—" "Your qualified armourers have been up there for 20 minutes, and they're about to start hitting it with a mallet," Jessup said. "I can clear that stoppage in about 3 seconds if you let me walk over there." Coleman opened his mouth to respond, but Lieutenant Park had overheard the exchange and walked over. Park was 26, West Point class of 2 years ago, and he carried himself with the particular brand of confidence that came from having graduated from a prestigious institution and not yet having been humbled by enough real-world experience to temper it. He looked at Jessup the way one might look at a well-meaning but misguided uncle at a family gathering. "Sir, we appreciate you coming out to watch qualification, but this is an operational training event and we can't have civilians interfering with weapons maintenance. Our team will handle it." Park's tone was polite in the way that dismissals often are, the kind of politeness that is actually a door being closed. Jessup looked at the lieutenant. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there for a moment, his hand resting on his cane, and then he said, very quietly. "Lieutenant, I was clearing .50 caliber malfunctions before your parents met. I commanded an M1 Abrams in the 7th Armoured Brigade. I was a tank commander in Desert Storm. I put 10,000 rounds through Medusa in combat. Real combat. Not a qualification range in Kansas." He paused. "Now, you can let me walk over there and fix your weapon, or you can stand here being polite while your entire training day falls apart. Your call." Park stared at him. Coleman stared at him. Coleman. The soldiers within earshot had gone quiet, the way people do when they sense the atmospheric pressure of a conversation change. Briggs, standing near the Humvee, looked at the old man with an expression that was half skepticism and half something that might have been the beginning of curiosity. Webb, still up on the Humvee, had turned from the weapon to look down at the exchange. Park hesitated. He was calculating. On one hand, letting an unverified civilian touch a jammed weapon on a live range was a regulatory nightmare. On the other hand, qualification was now 30 minutes behind schedule. The armourers were visibly stuck, and there were 2 more serials waiting to fire. He looked at Coleman. Coleman gave a barely perceptible shrug that communicated everything an NCO couldn't say to an officer in public. "Staff Sergeant Webb," Park called up. "Let this gentleman take a look." Webb stared down from the Humvee with an expression of pure professional offence. "Sir, I've got this under control. I don't need a civilian." "Staff Sergeant, let him look." Webb climbed down, his jaw set, his toolkit clenched in one hand. He stood to the side with his arms crossed, radiating the specific breed of irritation that comes from having your competence questioned by someone who outranks you. Jessup walked to the Humvee. He stopped at the side of the vehicle, looked at the turret, then carefully leaned his cane against the armoured door. The cane stayed upright, balanced against the flat surface, as if it knew to wait. Then, with a slowness that was not hesitation but economy, the old man climbed. His hands found the grab handles, his boots found the step. He pulled himself up with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle, something stored and conserved for moments exactly like this one. He rose into the turret and stood beside the M2 Browning, like a man returning to the side of an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He didn't touch the weapon immediately. He looked at it. His eyes moved over the receiver, the feed tray, the barrel, the charging handle, the way a mechanic looks at an engine or a doctor looks at a patient. Not searching randomly, reading. He reached out and placed his left hand flat on the top cover of the receiver, gently, almost tenderly, the way you might place your hand on the shoulder of someone who is in pain. His right hand moved to the backplate at the rear of the receiver and pressed against it. He frowned. Then he nodded, once, confirming something he had already known. "Backplate's a quarter turn loose," he said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. "Buffer spring isn't compressed enough. Bolt carrier rode forward off-center. Lugs hung up on the barrel extension. Your headspace is fine. Your timing is fine. Your buffer spring housing just needs to be reseated." Webb from below muttered, "That's what I was about to check." Jessup didn't acknowledge him. He adjusted his stance in the turret. Planting his feet, squaring his shoulders, he placed his left hand on the receiver for stability. He raised his right hand, open palm, fingers together, and held it about 6 inches above the charging handle. He was perfectly still for a moment, like a man gathering something invisible from the air around him. Then he struck. It was a single, precise blow. His open palm came down on the charging handle with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed off the Humvee's armour. It wasn't a wild hit. It wasn't brute force. It was targeted, calibrated, delivered at an exact angle and with an exact amount of force, the way a jeweller strikes a setting or a blacksmith strikes an anvil. The kind of blow that can only come from having done something so many times that the body remembers even when the mind has moved on to other things. The bolt slammed rearward. The charging handle travelled its full arc to the rear of the receiver and locked back with a clean, metallic chunk. The feed tray advanced. The weapon was clear. Silence. Absolute silence on the range. Jessup looked down at the weapon. He reached over, pulled the charging handle forward, let it ride back, and the bolt cycled smoothly, sliding home with the oiled precision that the M2 is known for when it's working the way John Browning intended. He did it again. Smooth. Clean. He then reached to the back plate and gave it a firm quarter turn, reseating the buffer spring housing with an audible click. He charged the weapon one more time. It cycled like a sewing machine. He looked down from the turret at the faces staring up at him. Coleman, whose clipboard was now hanging forgotten at his side. Park, whose West Point confidence had been replaced by something quieter and more honest. Webb, whose crossed arms had loosened, whose expression had shifted from offence to something that looked remarkably like awe. Diaz and Henning, standing with their mouths slightly open. Briggs, the young gunner, who was staring at the old man the way people stare at things they didn't think were possible. "She's good," Jessup said simply. "Check your buffer springs on the rest of your weapons before you fire them, and tell whoever reassembled this one to use a torque indicator on the backplate next time. Hand tight isn't tight enough." He climbed down from the Humvee slowly, carefully, each movement costing him something that he paid without complaint. When his feet touched the ground, he reached for his cane, and it was there, right where he had left it, waiting for him the way faithful things wait. He leaned on it, and for a moment the transformation was visible in reverse. The soldier becoming the old man again, the turret gunner becoming the retiree with the bad knees and the faded jacket. Briggs walked over. He didn't know what to say. He was 22 years old, and he had just watched a 75-year-old man do in 3 seconds what he and 3 armourers couldn't do in 30 minutes. His ego was bruised, but beneath the bruise was something else, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. Jessup looked at him. There was no smugness in his expression, no superiority, just the steady, measured gaze of a man who had been where Briggs was standing once, a long time ago. "Because the same thing happened to me in February of 91, he said. "My tank was in the breach during the ground offensive. We were pushing north through the obstacle belt into Iraq. My loader was on the .50, providing suppressive fire while our main gun engaged enemy positions. She jammed, same exact malfunction. Bolt locked forward, charging handle frozen. My loader panicked. He was 19. Good kid, but he'd never cleared a stoppage under fire before. We were taking small arms fire, and there was an Iraqi T-55 about 800 metres to our east that hadn't been engaged yet. I didn't have time to troubleshoot. I reached over from the commander's hatch, hit the charging handle with my palm, and the weapon came back up. We put 200 rounds through it in the next 4 minutes. That loader went on to become a platoon sergeant. Last I heard, he was teaching at the NCO Academy at Fort Bliss." He paused. "You learn a lot of things in the army, son. Most of them you learn from books and classrooms and training manuals. But there are some things you can only learn when somebody is shooting at you, and once you learn them that way, you don't forget." Briggs stood there for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was a small, humble nod, the kind of nod a person gives when they realise how much they don't know yet, and more importantly, when they decide that not knowing is not something to be ashamed of, but something to fix. The word moved through the range the way information moves through military formations, quickly and with embellishment. By the time Jessup had walked back toward the spectator area, the story had already grown from an old man fixing a gun to an old tank commander, performing a combat maneuver on a Humvee turret. Soldiers who hadn't seen it were asking soldiers who had, and soldiers who had were telling it with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of people who had just witnessed something they wanted to remember. Coleman, ever the practical NCO, was already on the radio getting the rest of the weapons checked before the next serial. But even Coleman kept glancing over at the old man with the cane. It was Lieutenant Park who went after him. Park, to his credit, had the self-awareness to recognise that he had been the one to nearly send Jessup away, and that recognition was sitting in his chest like a stone he needed to move. He jogged across the gravel and caught up to the old man near the rope line. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Jessup stopped walking. He turned, leaning on his cane, and looked at the lieutenant. "For what?" "For being dismissive. I should have listened to you from the start." Jessup studied him for a moment, and something in the old man's expression softened. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. The way you look at someone when you see them making the same mistakes you once made, and you know that the making of those mistakes is part of how they'll eventually get better. You were doing your job, Lieutenant. You had a live range, a jammed weapon, and an unverified old man walking past your control point. You were right to stop me. You were right to be cautious. What you were wrong about was assuming that because I'm old and using a cane, I couldn't possibly know more about that weapon than the people currently working on it. He paused. But that's not just your mistake. That's everybody's mistake. People look at someone like me and they see a liability. They see a slow walk and a bad hip and a body that doesn't work the way it used to. What they don't see is the 40 years I spent learning how to use every weapon system in the Army's inventory. What they don't see is 100,000 miles in armoured vehicles. What they don't see is Desert Storm. He tapped his cane lightly on the ground. This cane isn't a sign of weakness, son. It's a receipt for services rendered. Park didn't say anything for several seconds. When he did, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the performance confidence and replaced with something real. What unit were you with in Desert Storm, sir? 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment, Eagle Troop. I was a tank commander under Captain McMaster during the Battle of 73 Easting. Jessup said it the way someone might say their home address, something so fundamental to their identity that it required no emphasis. But Park's eyes widened. The Battle of 73 Easting was one of the most studied armoured engagements in modern military history, a lopsided American victory where a small force of cavalry scouts and tanks destroyed an entire brigade of the Iraqi Republican Guard in a running engagement through a sandstorm. It was taught at West Point. Park had written a paper on it. You were at 73 Easting, Park said, and it wasn't a question. I was at 73 Easting, Jessup confirmed. My tank engaged and destroyed 4 enemy vehicles that afternoon. We pushed through the Republican Guard's defensive positions and kept going. I had rounds impacting on my hull. I had my loader clearing that .50 caliber jam I just told you about while tracers were going over our heads. I had a driver who was 20 years old and scared out of his mind but drove that tank like he'd been born in it. He looked out across the range toward the distant targets and the flat Kansas horizon. That was 35 years ago, and I can still feel the vibration of that engine under my feet. I can still hear the main gun firing. I can still smell the cordite and the diesel. Those things don't leave you. They become part of you. And the skills that kept you alive, they don't leave either. They just wait until somebody needs them again. Park reached out his hand. Jessup took it. They shook, and in that handshake was something more than courtesy. It was an acknowledgement. A transfer of understanding between 2 soldiers separated by decades but connected by the same uniform, the same oath, and the same weapons. Word continued to spread. By the time the qualification resumed, Jessup had been identified by name and reputation. Somebody had called the unit's operations office, and the operations sergeant, a grizzled master sergeant named Tomlinson, who had been in the army for 28 years, came down to the range in a dead sprint when he heard the name Earl Jessup. Tomlinson had been a young private in the 2nd ACR's support battalion during Desert Storm. He hadn't served directly with Jessup, but he knew the name. Everyone who had served in the regiment knew the name. Master Sergeant Jessup, Eagle Troop, 73 Easting, the man who had commanded his tank with a calm that bordered on supernatural, who had directed fire on multiple enemy positions while simultaneously coaching his terrified crew through their first and only combat engagement, who had refused a medevac after taking shrapnel from an RPG near miss because he said his crew needed him more than the aid station did. Tomlinson found Jessup back at the spectator area, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, drinking coffee from a thermos that looked as old as the truck. Tomlinson walked up and stood at attention. Not the casual, going through the motions attention that soldiers give each other on garrison posts. Full, rigid, chin-up, chest-out attention. The kind of attention that means something. Master Sergeant Jessup, I'm Master Sergeant Tomlinson. I was in the support battalion, 2nd ACR, 1990-93. It's an honour, Master Sergeant. Jessup looked up from his coffee. He studied Tomlinson's face, the posture, the genuine respect in the man's bearing. And for the first time that morning the lines around Earl Jessup's eyes shifted. Not quite a smile. Something warmer than that. Something that comes from being seen. Really seen. Not as an old man with a cane, not as a spectator behind a rope line, but as what he was, what he had always been. At ease, Tomlinson, Jessup said. Sit down. Have some coffee. Tell me about your unit. And so Tomlinson sat, and they talked. They talked about the old regiment and the people who had served in it. They talked about the soldiers they had known who had gone on to great things, and the soldiers they had known who hadn't come home. They talked about how the army had changed and how it had stayed the same, and while they talked, something else was happening on the range, something quiet and unplanned. Briggs had gone back to the turret. The weapon was running perfectly now, its bolts cycling with the smooth, reliable rhythm that has made the M2 Browning the longest-serving weapon in the American arsenal. He fired his qualification course, and he fired it well, putting rounds on target with the kind of focused discipline that comes from having something to prove, not to the scorers or to his NCO, but to himself. When he finished, he climbed down from the turret and walked not to the scoring tent, but back to the spectator area. He found Jessup and Tomlinson still talking on the tailgate. "Master Sergeant Jessup," Briggs said, if you have time, would you be willing to show me how to properly check the buffer spring assembly and the back plate? I want to make sure I know how to set it up right. I don't want that to happen again." Jessup looked at the young soldier. He set down his coffee. He picked up his cane and stood slowly with the careful movements of a man who had earned every ache in his body. "Lead the way, specialist," he said. For the next 45 minutes, Earl Jessup stood beside the Humvee's turret and taught. Not from a manual, not from a PowerPoint slide, from memory, from experience, from the library of knowledge that 40 years of military service had written into his hands and his mind. He showed Briggs how to check the buffer spring tension by feel. He showed him how to verify the backplate seating without a torque indicator by using a specific hand technique that had been taught to him by his own tank commander in 1983. He showed him how to perform a combat speed malfunction clearance using the palm strike, explaining the angle, the force, the target point on the charging handle, making Briggs practice it until the motion was smooth and instinctive. Other soldiers gathered, Webb came over, and whatever professional pride had been wounded earlier was now overridden by genuine professional interest. Diaz and Henning stood at the edges taking notes. Even Park was there, standing slightly back listening. Jessup taught them all. He taught patiently, thoroughly, without condescension or showmanship. He answered every question. He corrected mistakes gently. He told stories from Desert Storm not to impress but to illustrate, to anchor each lesson in a real-world context that would make it stick in the way that classroom instruction sometimes doesn't. He told them about the time his loader's M2 jammed during a dust storm, and they cleared it blind, by feel alone, because the sand was so thick they couldn't see the weapon. He told them about the time a headspace failure nearly caused a catastrophic round separation, and what they had done to prevent it. He told them things that weren't in any technical manual, things that only existed in the living memory of the soldiers who had been there. When he was done, he leaned on his cane and looked at the group of young soldiers around him. "The M2 Browning has been defending this country since before your grandparents were born," he said. "She's older than all of you combined, and she'll still be here when you're my age, on some future range, watching some future soldier try to figure out why she won't cycle. Respect her, learn her, and when she talks to you, listen. She's trying to tell you something." The range qualification day finished 2 hours behind schedule, but it finished with something it hadn't started with. The soldiers who fired in the later serials handled their weapons with a noticeably different level of care. Buffer springs were checked, backplates were verified, headspace and timing were set with precision. Not because someone had told them to, because they had seen what happens when someone truly knows a weapon, and they wanted to be that person. Coleman wrote up the day's events in the unit's Training After Action report. In the section marked Significant Observations, he wrote a single sentence that captured more than any paragraph could. Retired Master Sergeant Earl Jessup, 2nd ACR veteran, provided impromptu weapons instruction that exceeded the training value of the scheduled qualification. Park endorsed the report and added a recommendation that the unit establish a formal mentorship connection with local retired NCOs and officers. The recommendation was approved. Jessup was invited back. He came every month. 6 months later, the unit held its next annual weapons qualification. Every .50 caliber fired that day functioned without a single malfunction. Briggs, now a sergeant, was the one conducting the pre-fire inspections. He checked every buffer spring by hand. He verified every backplate with the technique Jessup had taught him. And when a new private climbed into the turret for the first time, nervous and unsure, Briggs leaned over and told the kid something an old tank commander had once told him. "Listen to the weapon. She's trying to tell you something." Earl Jessup watched from the spectator area, leaning on his cane, drinking coffee from his old thermos. He didn't need to come down to the line this time. His knowledge was already there, living in the hands and minds of the soldiers he had taught. That was the real legacy. Not medals, not records, not stories. The things you teach, the things that pass from one soldier to the next, across decades and generations, keeping people alive, keeping weapons running, keeping the chain unbroken. One palm strike, 3 seconds, 35 years of experience behind it, and a lesson that will outlast every piece of equipment on that range. Never assume that age means absence. Never assume that a cane means incapability. And never, ever underestimate a soldier who has heard the sound of Medusa in combat. They carry something that no training manual can give and no amount of time can take away. They carry the real thing. If you believe that the experience of those who served should never be forgotten, subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who respects the old guard, and the next time you see an old veteran with a cane, remember, you're not looking at what they lost, you're looking at what they survived.